The telegram arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters on December 21st, 1945. General George S. Patton, Jr., 60 years old, was dead. 12 days after a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, his body had finally surrendered to injuries his will could not overcome. Eisenhower sat at his desk, the paper between his fingers, and for a moment the weight of command lifted and left only grief. He'd lost the most brilliant, most infuriating, most indispensable subordinate he'd ever had. And now, for the first time, he could say so without qualification. During the war, Eisenhower had never been able to speak freely about Patton. Every public statement had required careful calibration. Praise Patton's genius, yes, but always with implicit caveats about discipline and judgment. Acknowledge his results, absolutely, but never without the shadow of his scandals. The living Patton had been a command problem wrapped in battlefield brilliance, a weapon so powerful and so volatile that using it meant constant risk management. The dead Patton could finally be remembered as what he actually was. Eisenhower drafted his official statement that evening. "General Patton was one of the most brilliant soldiers America has produced," he wrote. The words felt insufficient, too formal for what he actually meant. But they were also liberated. No hedging. No, despite certain incidents, or though he sometimes. Just the clean acknowledgement of genius. He would spend the next 3 years expanding on that admission, writing it into his memoir, speaking it in interviews, letting the full truth of Patton emerge now that the man himself could no longer complicate it with fresh controversies. Their relationship had begun a quarter-century earlier, when both were young officers in the Infant Tank Corps, stationed at Camp Meade, Maryland. Patton had been the senior man then, a cavalry officer who'd fought with tanks in France during the First World War. Eisenhower had been the student, eager and theoretical, fascinated by the potential of armored warfare. They'd spent hours arguing tactics, designing training programs, imagining how tanks might transform battle. Patton had been dashing, wealthy, supremely confident. Eisenhower had been methodical, middle-class, quietly ambitious. They'd liked each other, respected each other's minds, shared a vision of mechanized warfare that the Army's leadership considered dangerously radical. But the decades had reversed their positions. By 1942, when America entered the war in Europe, Eisenhower wore stars, and Patton answered to him. The student had become the supreme commander. The teacher had become the weapon to be aimed. It was Eisenhower who decided where Patton would fight, when he would fight, whether he would fight at all. And that inversion created a tension that would define both men's war. Patton commanded the Western Task Force in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, in November 1942. He landed at Casablanca and fought his way inland with the speed and aggression that would become his signature. Eisenhower watched from headquarters in Gibraltar, receiving reports of Patton's advance, noting the pace, the decisiveness, the way Patton seemed to understand instinctively how to keep an enemy off balance. This was what Patton did. This was what made him irreplaceable. But even then, even in those early months, Eisenhower could see the other side. Patton's communications were sometimes insubordinate. His methods were harsh. He drove his men relentlessly, tolerated no weakness, demanded results without excuses. Soldiers feared him, respected him, sometimes hated him. Eisenhower received complaints, whispers, reports of Patton's temperament. He filed them away, weighed them against results, and kept Patton in command. The calculus was simple. Patton won battles. Everything else was secondary. Sicily made the calculus more complicated. In July 1943, Patton commanded the 7th Army in the invasion of Sicily, landing on the southern coast while British forces under Montgomery landed to the east. The plan called for Montgomery to drive north toward Messina while Patton protected his flank. But Patton had no intention of playing a supporting role. He pushed his army northwest to Palermo, then pivoted east and raced Montgomery to Messina, driving his men through heat and exhaustion, accepting casualties that other commanders might have considered excessive, determined to prove that American forces could match British speed and daring. He reached Messina first on August 17th. It was a propaganda victory, a morale boost, a demonstration that American arms had come of age. Eisenhower was pleased. The campaign had succeeded. Sicily was secured. Patton had delivered exactly what Eisenhower needed him to deliver. Then came the reports about the slapping incidents. On August 3rd, Patton had visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. Walking among the wounded, he'd encountered Private Charles H. Cool, sitting on a cot, no visible injuries, diagnosed with battle fatigue. Patton had asked what was wrong. Cool had said he couldn't take it anymore, that his nerves were shot. And Patton, who believed that cowardice was a disease that infected armies, who thought that showing weakness encouraged weakness, had slapped the man across the face with his gloves, called him a coward, and ordered him back to the front. 7 days later, on August 10th, at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, Patton had done it again. Private Paul G. Bennett, also diagnosed with battle fatigue, also showing no physical wounds. Patton had slapped him twice, pulled his pistol, threatened to shoot him, called him yellow. Medical staff had intervened. Bennett had been led away. Patton had left the hospital convinced he'd done the right thing, that he'd prevented cowardice from spreading, that tough love was the only cure for what he saw as moral failure. Eisenhower learned of the incidents in mid-August. Doctors had filed reports. Word had spread through the medical corps. And now it sat on Eisenhower's desk, a command crisis wrapped in moral complexity. Patton had assaulted soldiers under his command. He'd violated basic principles of military discipline and medical care. By any standard, he deserved to be relieved, possibly court-martialed, certainly sent home in disgrace. But Patton had also just won Sicily. He was already being positioned for the invasion of Italy, possibly for the eventual invasion of France. He was, in Eisenhower's assessment, the best offensive commander America had. Losing him meant losing battlefield capability that couldn't be replaced. The question wasn't whether Patton had done wrong. The question was whether the wrong was so severe that it outweighed his military value. Eisenhower made his decision. Patton would stay in command, but he would apologize. Personally to both soldiers. Publicly to every division in his army. He would stand before his men and acknowledge his error. Humble himself, accept responsibility. It was punishment without relief. Accountability without dismissal. Eisenhower believed it was enough. For 2 months it worked. Patton delivered his apologies. The soldiers accepted them. The incidents remained internal, known to the medical corps and senior command, but not to the press or public. Patton continued planning for Italy. Eisenhower continued believing he'd managed the crisis successfully. Then, in November, the press found out. Drew Pearson, the columnist, broke the story on his radio broadcast. Suddenly, the slapping incidents were national news. Suddenly, Eisenhower's decision to retain Patton was under scrutiny. Congress received letters demanding Patton's dismissal. Newspapers editorialized about military discipline and the treatment of combat fatigue. The War Department fielded questions about whether Patton would face court-martial. Eisenhower defended his decision. He issued statements explaining Patton's value, acknowledging the incidents, but insisting the matter had been handled appropriately. He wrote to the War Department, to Marshall, to anyone who questioned the choice, making the same argument. Patton's battlefield genius outweighed his personal failings. We need him. We cannot win without him. The incidents were serious, but they were addressed. Moving forward requires keeping him in command. Privately, Eisenhower was furious. Not at Patton for the slappings themselves, though he found them reprehensible, but at Patton for creating a situation that jeopardized the war effort, that forced Eisenhower to spend political capital defending the indefensible. that turned a command decision into a public relations crisis. This was what Patton did. This was the cost of his brilliance. He won battles and created disasters in equal measure, and managing him meant constantly cleaning up messes while trying to harness his talents. The controversy eventually subsided. Patton remained in command, but his role in Italy was diminished. Instead, Eisenhower began planning to use him for the invasion of France, for the breakout from Normandy, for the drive across Europe that would end the war. And he began planning to use Patton in another way, as deception. In the months before D-Day, Eisenhower created the 1st United States Army Group, a phantom force supposedly massed in southeastern England, supposedly preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais. The Germans, watching from across the Channel, needed to believe this force was real, that the Normandy invasion was a feint, that the real blow would fall elsewhere. And to make them believe, Eisenhower needed a commander they would find credible. He needed someone whose reputation for aggression and offensive warfare was so well established that his presence would confirm the deception. He gave the phantom command to Patton. For months, Patton played the role. He visited fake installations, he gave speeches to non-existent units, he allowed himself to be photographed at locations that suggested Pas-de-Calais preparations, and the Germans, who respected Patton's abilities, who believed he was America's most dangerous commander, concluded that wherever Patton was, the real invasion would follow. They kept divisions at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after Normandy, waiting for Patton's attack, convinced the real blow was yet to come. It was brilliant deception, and it worked because Patton's reputation made it believable. Eisenhower had turned Patton's fame into a weapon, had used the man's own legend to mislead the enemy, but it also meant keeping Patton out of the initial invasion, keeping him in England while other commanders led the assault, keeping him sidelined during the most important operation of the war. Patton hated it. He understood the necessity, accepted the strategic logic, but hated every moment of watching others fight while he posed for reconnaissance photographs. When he finally received command of the Third Army in late July, after the breakout from Normandy, he was unleashed fury. Everything he'd been denied, all the combat he'd missed, all the frustration of months playing a ghost commander, he channeled into his army's advance. The Third Army's drive across France in August and September 1944 was warfare, as Patton imagined it should be. Speed, aggression, exploitation of breakthrough, pursuit of a broken enemy. His tanks covered distances that other commanders thought impossible. His logistics officers scrounged fuel and ammunition when supplies ran short. His divisions bypassed resistance, drove through gaps, encircled German forces before they could establish new defensive lines. In 30 days, the Third Army advanced from Normandy to the German border, liberating most of France, inflicting casualties the Germans couldn't replace, demonstrating what mechanized warfare could achieve when commanded with audacity and speed. Eisenhower watched the advance with satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction because Patton was delivering results beyond what anyone had predicted. Concern because Patton's speed was outrunning his supply lines, because his aggressive independence sometimes conflicted with the broader strategic plan, because managing Patton still meant constant vigilance against the next crisis. The crisis came in September, when Patton's advance stalled for lack of fuel. Eisenhower had prioritized supplies for Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault into Holland. Patton's Third Army, at the end of a long supply line, received reduced allocations. Patton was livid. He argued that given fuel, he could reach the Rhine, possibly cross it, possibly end the war before winter. Eisenhower disagreed. The broad front strategy required supporting multiple advances, not betting everything on a single thrust. Patton would have to wait. It was the right decision strategically, but it meant restraining Patton at the moment of his greatest success, holding back the commander who just demonstrated what he could achieve when given freedom to exploit. Patton complied because he was a soldier and Eisenhower was supreme commander, but the frustration was evident in every communication, every report, every request for additional resources. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, and suddenly Patton was indispensable again. In December 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive in the West, driving through the Ardennes, creating a bulge in the Allied lines, threatening to split the American forces and reach the Meuse River. Eisenhower called a conference at Verdun on December 19th. His commanders gathered to discuss response options. The situation was serious. The Germans had achieved surprise, had committed their reserves, had created a crisis that required immediate counteraction. Eisenhower asked how quickly forces could be redirected north to relieve Bastogne, the key town that American forces were defending against encirclement. Other commanders talked about needing days, maybe a week, to disengage from current positions, reorganize, move north, and attack. Patton said he could attack in 48 hours. The other commanders thought he was boasting. Moving 3 divisions 90 degrees across winter roads in combat conditions and launching a coordinated attack within 2 days seemed impossible. Patton insisted it was feasible. He'd already begun planning, had anticipated the need, had issued preliminary orders to his staff. Give him the word, and he'd move. Eisenhower gave him the word. Within 48 hours, Patton's Third Army pivoted north and attacked the southern flank of the German Bulge. Within a week, his forces had broken through to Bastogne, relieved the surrounded garrison, and begun pushing the Germans back. It was the kind of operational flexibility and speed that other armies couldn't match, the kind of performance that justified every headache Patton had ever caused. Eisenhower wrote in his diary that night about Patton's confidence, about his ability to deliver on seemingly impossible promises, about the value of having a commander who could improvise at that level. But he also wrote about the difficulty of managing such a personality, about the constant need to balance Patton's brilliance against his indiscipline. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Patton's Third Army had driven deep into Germany, had liberated concentration camps, had captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, had helped break the Wehrmacht's capacity to resist. Eisenhower wrote to Marshall praising Patton's performance, acknowledging his contribution, recommending him for high honors, but he also prepared for the next challenge, managing Patton in peacetime. Patton was given command of Bavaria, responsible for occupation and denazification. It was administrative work, political work, the kind of careful governance that required diplomatic sensitivity and policy adherence. Patton hated it. He hated the denazification policies, thought they were destroying German administrative capacity, believed that former Nazi Party members should be employed if they had technical skills. He said so publicly in press conferences, comparing Nazi Party membership to being a Democrat or Republican in America. The press seized on the comments. Once again, Patton had created a public relations crisis. Once again, Eisenhower had to defend or discipline him. This time, Eisenhower chose discipline. In October 1945, he relieved Patton of command of the Third Army and gave him command of the 15th Army, a paper organization responsible for writing historical reports. It was a demotion disguised as a transfer, a way to remove Patton from policy-making while preserving his rank and dignity. Patton accepted the reassignment with bitterness. He understood what it meant. His war was over. His usefulness had ended. The qualities that made him invaluable in combat made him a liability in occupation. Eisenhower had made the calculation again, and this time the balance had shifted. 2 months later, Patton was dead. The car accident on December 9th had broken his neck, left him paralyzed from the neck down. He'd lain in the hospital in Heidelberg, conscious but immobile, knowing he would never recover, never return to duty, never command again. On December 21st, an embolism stopped his heart. He was buried at the American cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers he'd led, wearing the stars he'd earned, remembered as the warrior he'd been. Eisenhower attended the funeral. He stood in the cold rain, watched the coffin lowered, saluted the grave. And in the days after, he began writing about Patton differently. The official statement called him one of America's most brilliant soldiers. Private letters went further. To Marshall, Eisenhower wrote that Patton had been irreplaceable, that his loss diminished the Army's capability, that no one else could have achieved what Patton had achieved in France and Germany. But it was in Crusade in Europe, his memoir published in 1948, that Eisenhower made his fullest admission about Patton. He wrote about the slapping incidents, acknowledging how close he'd come to relieving Patton, explaining his decision to retain him. He wrote about Patton's drive across France, calling it one of the most brilliant campaigns in American military history. He wrote about the relief of Bastogne, about Patton's operational genius, about his ability to inspire soldiers and terrify enemies. And he wrote this. Quote, for later, in interviews and speeches, Eisenhower would expand on that assessment, calling Patton, quote, 5. These were not the careful, qualified statements Eisenhower had made during the war. These were unhedged acknowledgments of genius. The caveats were still there, the discussions of Patton's flaws and controversies, but they no longer dominated the narrative. The living Patton had required constant management, constant balancing of brilliance against liability. The dead Patton could be remembered for what he actually was, a military genius whose talents were so extraordinary that they justified the costs of using them. What Eisenhower admitted after Patton's death was something he could never fully admit during Patton's life, that Patton was right about himself, that his self-assessment, his belief in his own abilities, his confidence that he was the best offensive commander America had, was accurate. During the war, Eisenhower had to qualify that truth, had to balance it against discipline and politics and public opinion. After the war, with Patton gone, he could state it cleanly. But the admission went deeper than just acknowledging Patton's military skill. What Eisenhower really admitted was that the decision to keep using Patton, despite everything, had been correct. Every time Patton had created a crisis, every time Eisenhower had been forced to defend him or discipline him or manage the fallout from his latest controversy, Eisenhower had faced the question of whether Patton was worth the trouble. And every time he'd concluded that Patton was. The slapping incidents could have ended Patton's career. Eisenhower chose to preserve it. The denazification controversy could have led to court-martial. Eisenhower chose relief from command instead. At every decision point, Eisenhower had chosen to keep Patton available, to keep him in the fight, to accept the costs because the benefits were irreplaceable. After Patton's death, Eisenhower could admit that those decisions had been vindicated, that the breakout from Normandy, the drive across France, the relief of Bastogne, all of it had justified the risks, that Patton's contribution to victory had been so significant that the controversies, in retrospect, seemed like acceptable prices to pay. There was also an admission about the nature of command itself, about what it meant to lead a coalition, to manage personalities, to balance competing demands. Eisenhower's genius was different from Patton's. Patton was a battlefield commander, a tactical and operational artist who understood how to move armies and break enemies. Eisenhower was a strategic commander, a coalition manager who understood how to balance military operations with political reality, how to keep allies working together, how to subordinate individual brilliance to collective success. Managing Patton had been one of Eisenhower's most difficult challenges. Patton was brilliant but undisciplined, effective but controversial, indispensable but dangerous. Using him meant constant risk assessment, constant intervention, constant balancing of his strengths against his weaknesses. It would have been easier to relieve him, to find someone more manageable, to avoid the headaches, but easier would have meant less effective, and effectiveness was what mattered. After Patton's death, Eisenhower could admit that the difficulty had been worth it. That managing difficult genius was part of supreme command. That sometimes the best commanders were the hardest to control, and that controlling them wasn't always the right goal. Sometimes the right goal was channeling them, pointing them at the enemy, accepting the chaos they created because the results they delivered were worth the cost. In his later years, as president, as elder statesman, Eisenhower would often be asked about Patton, and his answers became more admiring with time, more willing to emphasize the genius and minimize the flaws. He would tell stories about Patton's confidence before Bastogne, about his speed across France, about his ability to inspire soldiers. The controversies would be mentioned, but briefly as footnotes to the larger story of military excellence. Some of this was natural memory, the way time softens rough edges and highlights achievements. Some of it was the luxury of retrospect, the ability to judge decisions by their outcomes rather than their risks. But some of it was genuine admission, the acknowledgement of truth that couldn't be spoken while Patton lived. Eisenhower had known, even during the war, that Patton was extraordinary. But he'd also known that saying so publicly, without qualification, would have made Patton harder to manage, would have emboldened his worst instincts, would have suggested that genius exempted someone from discipline. So Eisenhower had praised carefully, criticized privately, and maintained the balance that allowed Patton to be effective without becoming uncontrollable. After Patton's death, that balance was no longer necessary. Eisenhower could praise without worrying about the consequences. He could acknowledge Patton's full measure without fearing it would lead to the next crisis. And in doing so, he revealed what he'd always known but couldn't always say, that Patton was irreplaceable, that his contribution to victory was fundamental, that the decision to keep using him despite everything was one of the best decisions Eisenhower had made. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton was never simple friendship. It was professional respect, complicated by personal frustration, mutual admiration, strained by constant tension. Eisenhower valued Patton's abilities while deploring his indiscipline. Patton respected Eisenhower's position while resenting his authority. They needed each other, relied on each other, and irritated each other in equal measure. But after Patton's death, Eisenhower could focus on what mattered most, that when it counted, Patton had delivered. That when the breakout from Normandy needed a commander who could exploit chaos and turn breakthrough into pursuit, Patton had been that commander. That when Bastogne needed relief in 48 hours, Patton had made it happen. That when the Third Army needed to cross France in a month, Patton had driven them across. These were the facts that outlived the controversies. These were the achievements that justified the risks. And these were what Eisenhower finally admitted, fully and without qualification after Patton was gone. On the day of Patton's funeral, standing in the rain at the American cemetery in Luxembourg, Eisenhower looked at the rows of white crosses stretching across the hillside. Thousands of soldiers, many of them from Patton's Third Army, buried in the soil they'd helped liberate. Patton had driven them hard, had accepted casualties other commanders might have avoided, had demanded speed and aggression and results without excuses. And they had delivered, had followed him across Europe, had fought with the intensity he demanded. Eisenhower understood, perhaps more clearly in that moment than ever before, what Patton had given to the war effort. Not just tactical victories or operational success, but a kind of relentless offensive spirit that had broken the Wehrmacht's will to resist. Patton had shown that American forces could match German professionalism, could exceed German speed, could dominate German commanders in mobile warfare. He had proven that the American way of war, with its emphasis on logistics and firepower and rapid exploitation, could succeed against the best armies Europe had produced. That proof had been essential. That demonstration had been irreplaceable. And that was what Eisenhower finally admitted, standing at Patton's grave, watching the coffin lowered into the ground. That for all his flaws, for all the crises and controversies and headaches, Patton had been exactly what the war required. That using him had been right. That keeping him had been necessary. That the decision to retain him after the slapping incidents, to defend him against calls for dismissal, to channel his brilliance despite his indiscipline, had been vindicated by victory. It was an admission Eisenhower could only make after Patton was dead, because making it while Patton lived would have changed their relationship, would have shifted the balance of authority and accountability that made their partnership work. But it was an admission Eisenhower believed completely, had always believed, even when he couldn't say it plainly. George S. Patton, Jr. had been one of the most brilliant soldiers America ever produced. Eisenhower knew it during the war, managed around it, leveraged it for victory. After Patton's death, he could finally say it without qualification, could finally acknowledge the full measure of the man without worrying about the consequences. That acknowledgement, that unhedged praise, that willingness to emphasize genius over controversy, was what Eisenhower finally admitted about Patton after his death. Not that Patton had been perfect, but that his imperfections had been worth tolerating. Not that he'd been easy to command, but that commanding him had been essential to victory. Not that he'd been a simple hero, but that his complicated brilliance had been exactly what the war required. In the years after, whenever Eisenhower spoke about the war, about the decisions he'd made, about the commanders he'd relied on, Patton's name always emerged with special emphasis. The most brilliant commander of an army in the open field. Irreplaceable in pursuit and exploitation. The man who could do what others thought impossible. These were the admissions, the acknowledgments, the truths that Eisenhower finally spoke freely once Patton was gone. And they were truths he'd known all along.